In the dimming glow of a sinking sun, the Alabama plantation held its breath, poised between the dying past and an uncertain dawn. The heavy air was thick with the scent of scorched earth, sweat, and smoke from fading hearth fires. As the light slipped beneath the horizon, long shadows spilled across cotton fields, stretching like the fingers of those bound to the land. What secrets did this land hold in its soil, and who would claim its bitter inheritance under the coming night? The weight of what was to come hung invisible, yet unbearably heavy. The plantation was a kingdom made of wood and iron, ruled by unyielding hierarchies etched into every rough surface. The large cotton fields lay sprawling, a sea of pale, brittle balls trembling in the evening breeze. Small cabins of weathered timber leaned against the horizon, where the enslaved lived cramped in close quarters, the coarse fabric of their lives worn thin but stubborn. Deep in the heart of this world was Samuel, his sinewy hands scarred from the endless toil, his gaze steady but flickering with unspoken storms. Each breath he drew tasted of dust and endurance, body coiled beneath the weight of a coming reckoning. The overseer's harsh commands had become the rhythm of the plantation's day, their iron boots trampling hope like dry leaves underfoot. Yet tonight was different. Tonight, the very air crackled with a tension born of whispered rumors and brittle resolve. Samuel stood against this architectural web of oppression, a man shaped by cruelty, caught between silent fury and a fierce grasp for freedom. The groan of a creaking hinge, a cloth dragged along rough floorboards, these sounds marked the slow march toward a night destined for blood and earth. Would this buried fury find voice before dawn? Inside the slave quarters, voices were hushed but fierce in their determination. Among the worn wooden bunks and soot-blackened walls, plans whispered like the rustling of dry leaves. Samuel's eyes traced the rough ropes coiled silently in a corner, symbols of the chains that bound them and the instruments that might unbind their souls. The scent of lamp oil mingled with the coppery tang of sweat as anticipation thickened the air. Which among them would dare to cross the invisible line when law and cruelty cracked open like splintering wood? The looming question pressed down, could vengeance be the price of their freedom? Outside, the overseers drank deep at a flickering lantern's glow, their voices heavy with false bravado and stark denial. The crude artifacts of their power, a worn whip, stained gloves, and rough leather boots, seemed suddenly fragile in the face of a tide they could not fathom. Their laughter was brittle, fraying at the edges like the coarse fabric of their battered hats. Yet beneath this veneer lurked a shadow of dread as the night stretched taut with unspoken fears. What did they not see gathering just beyond the flickering light, waiting in silence to tip the scales forever? As the clock's slow chime heralded the midnight hour, abolition found its footing beneath the exhausted stars. The decree that ripped through the land like a bitter wind unsettled every breath and heartbeat upon the plantation. Samuel's hands tightened around the rough wood of his worn cot, his breath shallow, the rustle of fabric taut with resolve. The overseers marched unknowingly toward their fate, their heavy steps thudding against the earth like a death knell. What twisted justice unfolded as ropes became burial shrouds and soil swallowed the cries of the oppressed. Beneath the weight of darkness, the slave quarters became a tomb and a stage, rope trapping flesh and earth, embracing secrets. The tactile rush of coarse fibers biting skin echoed through the silence, mingling with muffled gasps and the slow descent of cold soil. Each shovelful, a final verdict, each tightened knot, a reversal of power long denied. The night held its breath as earth claimed its own, burying vengeance beneath the fragile hope of freedom's first light. What price would be paid when dawn bled through the cracks? The first light of a reluctant dawn broke across a plantation forever changed. A heat that clawed at skins and cracked lips seemed to carry the weight of silence, bone deep and unyielding. Rumors swirled like dust devils, twisting fear and fascination into strange new forms. Samuel's gaze wrestled with ghosts that had no rest, ghosts of justice, mercy, and survival mingling within every breath of cotton-scented air. Would the chains that bound him now bind his conscience, Or could freedom bloom in soil stained with dark deeds? Voices rose from the fields, fragmented as the fractured light, a preacher's hopeful hymn, a doctor's quiet lament, the whisper of rumors distorted by fear, and overseers' rattled commands. Each spoke fractured truths caught between memory and erasure, illuminating a society trembling on the cusp of transformation. The ledger leaves gaps where stories might fill or falter. What will survive the passage of time, myth, memory, or the cold record of what was buried beneath the soil and silence? Would you dare to unearth such histories and face what lingers still? Power shifted beneath trembling hands, wielded by lawmen hunting shadows and secrets in a world unraveling at its seams. Chains clanked and boots marched in cadence with a brutal authority, tearing through fragile bonds with machines of punishment. Justice was a thin, jagged line blurred by raw human desperation and stark retribution. The cold clink of iron echoed where birdsong once soared, marking a grim new order locked in relentless pursuit of ghosts. How long could silence hold before it shattered under the weight of reckoning? Chaos broke loose among shattered alliances and families torn asunder. Samuel, caught in the whirlwind of revolt and ruin, faced the cost of his choice, a reckoning written in the clash of rope and dirt, in the weight of blood and hope intertwined. His body carried marks deeper than skin, his mind shadowed by irreversible acts. The plantation transformed into a theater of despair and defiance, where every breath was a verdict and every heartbeat a question hanging unanswered in heavy air. Could justice and survival ever coexist within such fractured soil? In the charred aftermath, a nation sought its new face amid the ashes. Samuel's fate was a slow turn through cold streets and colder hearts, a reflection of a country wrestling with freedom's bitter twin, violence tempered by silence. Ash and cotton filled the air, their mingled scent a haunting reminder of stories left unspoken. What echoes remain when the fires fade and memory frays around the edges of history's fragile fabric? The slow pan of time reveals forgotten truths sewn into the very earth. Decades later, a fragile web of memory binds descendants across generations as they sift through myth and archive in search of a truth obscured by fading paper and fading voices. Ghosts of rope and earth haunt their fragile reconstruction, a testament to histories both preserved and erased. What remains when the forgotten becomes the only witness? What lingers beneath the weight of selective remembrance, urging us to listen beyond silence and dust? The motif tightens: who owns the past when the custodians of memory falter? The tale closes on a crossroads where justice and revenge entwine with forgiveness and silence. Samuel's story provokes a reckoning that reaches into the present, a call to wrestle with buried histories and the chains stretched between past and present. The rope motif pulses as a binding force and a line severed in resolve, a final image carved into lingering darkness. Who inherits what was buried deep in soil and sorrow, and who dares to release it into the light? A low murmur drifted through the cramped quarters, barely more than a breath against the rough-hewn walls. Here, the worn wooden slats held the faint residue of silent suffering, surfaces scored by weary hands, hushed prayers spoken in the dark, and dreams muffled beneath threadbare quilts. The air hung heavy, saturated with the mingling scents of lamp oil and sweat. Amid faint rustlings and the subtle scrape of fabric, whispered plans wound through the shadows, a quiet conspiracy swelling beneath the watchful eyes of betrayal and fear alike. What moves were being laid in this confined fortress of cotton and chain? Samuel's gaze flicked to the coiled length of coarse rope resting in the corner, its fibers frayed but formidable, a tactile reminder of bonds, both present and undone. His fingers brushed against its rough texture, almost unconsciously, tracing the memory of restraint and resistance woven into every twist. Around him, others spoke in clipped tones, voices tense yet resolute. Each exchange was a fragile thread in a tapestry of long-held grievances and desperate hopes. Would the worn ropes that once bound bodies now serve as tools of release or vengeance? The overseer's cruelty had not slackened with the promise of abolition. Instead, their contempt hardened, chafing against the inevitable, like iron scraping stone. Their boots thudded near, sharp, impatient, shrouded in the scent of sweat and cheap tobacco, a harsh cadence over damp earth. Invisible but palpable, tension thickened the night air, tightening like a noose inches from a neck. Suspicion rippled beneath the surface, an undercurrent of silent watching, waiting. What hidden fury would the long-oppressed unleash as the hour neared, and who would dare cross the thin line that divided subjugation from retribution? Would you remain silent in such a crucible of fear and hope, where every glance might betray, every breath hold a secret plan? Beneath the scratching of coarse cloth and a creaking door hinge, lives trembled like the fragile flame of a solitary candle in a gusting wind. Samuel's chest rose slow and tight. The rhythm of his breath mirrored the distant drip of water echoing in hollow spaces. The night stillness was a skin stretched taut, one moment before snapping. What would dawn reveal in the place where whispered chains were about to become thundering revolutions? The lease on fear was about to expire, and with it came the reckoning stitched into the fabric of this shared confinement, tattered, resilient, and burning with the promise of change. The 5 overseers gathered beneath the dim glow of a lantern, their faces cast in harsh chiaroscuro, rough skin mapped by sun and smoke. Their voices were thick with the stale scent of cheap whiskey and the brittle arrogance of men convinced of their absolute dominion. They joked clumsily, laughter scraped raw by the weight of a world slipping fast beyond their grasp. Around them lay the artifacts of their power, worn whips coiled like serpents at their sides, splintered riding crops, and boots scuffed by ceaseless stride across unforgiving earth. Yet beneath their bravado, a fraying tension pulsed, fragile as the flickering candle flame casting uncertain shadows on weathered faces. They spoke of futures lost in rumbling tones, mocked the distant promise of abolition, and scoffed at the whispered fears that threaded the cotton bowls. The heavy oak table where they leaned bore scars from many such nights. Whiskey spills congealed like old wounds, and ash from stubbed cigars drifted in the heavy air. Their camaraderie was brittle, like dry wood about to splinter under pressure. Their eyes flicked toward windows shuttered tight, senses sharpened by a silent dread they refused to name. What ghosts crawled just beyond the threshold? Specters of rebellion or retribution. The gallows of their futures creaked faintly in the hush of coming midnight. Their footsteps boomed hollow in the empty corridors as they paced, boots thudding a rhythm that seemed to echo doom itself. The leather of reins and saddles creaked softly under tense hands. The metallic clink of keys and chains punctuated the night's oppressive stillness. They were men tethered by pride and fear, caught in the edge of a world unraveling. The night air held a sudden chill, despite the summer heat, a cold that seemed to seep through cracked windows and into their bones. Outside, the cotton stirred under a breathless sky, the stars dimmed as if shielding what was about to unfold. Could these keepers of order grasp the storm they had sown? Their arrogance was a fragile armor, vulnerable to the patient fury that lurked in dark corners. They did not hear the soft scrape of movement from the quarters, the hushed undercurrent of plotting that threaded beneath the plantation's creaking skeleton. The weight of ropes and soil pressed invisibly around them, a tight net woven from years of cruelty spun to catch its tormentors. As the final minutes crept forward, the threshold between dominion and downfall thinned like worn cloth at a seam. What fate awaited these men blinded by their own hubris, as the land beneath promised a reckoning long overdue? When midnight struck, it was not just the turning of a clock, but the birth hour of a new and violent reality. The plantation exhaled beneath a cloak of heavy darkness, where breath hung thick like smoke, and the scent of damp earth mixed with worn leather and bitter sweat. Emancipation's whisper swept through the cotton fields like a restless wind, unsettling even the deepest roots of power and fear. Samuel's body was taut beneath the coarse cotton fabric, his chest rising in short, measured breaths as the weight of fate pressed down with relentless certainty. Outside, the overseers approached the quarters, their staggers muted by shadows, but heavy with cruel intent. Their boots scuffed over loose gravel, a dull percussion that thumped through the stale night air, a heartbeat counting down what none dared speak aloud. The coarse fraying of rope lay coiled within Samuel's reach, a tactile promise of both restraint and release, binding him to the act that would change everything. The metallic rattle of keys, the creak of worn hinges, and the dry scrape of wood on wood whispered of a grim theater about to unfold. What secret justice stirred in this darkness, measured in stolen moments and breath held tight? Within the close confines of the slave quarters, time fractured into shards. Each pulse of Samuel's restrained breath echoed against walls blackened by years of smoke and sorrow. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned faces dimly lit by the flicker of a single tallow candle, the flame's stuttering dance, a fragile mirror of rising tension. Around him, hands clenched and unclenched, a chorus of suppressed rage steeled against the night's approaching storm. Would these ropes become the instruments of justice, or the last binds of despair tied in haste? The passage of abolition did not soothe rage. It fanned the embers into a blaze of imminent retribution. The overseers, blind in their drunken certainty, moved with lethal drunkenness toward their own undoing, unaware that the rope once used for punishment would now seal their fate. The night air thickened, smelling of wet earth and iron, the slow drag of soil underfoot marking the turning tide. Each movement against the silence was a crack in the old world's brittle facade, as the quiet fury of the oppressed stepped from shadow to grim light. Would justice be reaped in silence or scream beneath the moon? Samuel's grasp tightened on rope, coarse against his palms, the weight of countless stolen moments of suffering, compressed into a decisive act. The ambient silence shattered by the faintest sounds, a stifled gasp, a sudden scuffle. The tightening of bindings marked the irreversible crossing from years of quiet endurance to a night stained with fate. As earth awaited its grim cargo, burial and liberation converged, wrapped in the same rough fibers. What price must be paid when oppression is buried alive in the soil of its own making? The act was swift but heavy, a dark ritual carved from centuries of pain and unspoken fury. Samuel and his allies moved in the dense shadows of the slave quarters, the coarse ropes rough against their hands, the weight of earth pressed cold and moist beneath their boots. Each binding was deliberate, knots tightened with the precision born of desperate necessity, flesh constrained as if the very fibers of oppression had thickened beneath trembling fingers. The scent of wet soil rose, mingling with the acrid tang of sweat and the faint smoke of fading lamps. What was buried in that bitter earth was more than bodies. It was a reckoning encoded in fiber and clay. The prisoners, once wielders of cruel commands, were silenced beneath a rough veil of soil. The muffled gasps, stifled struggles, and the taut snap of ropes against skin fused into a grim symphony beneath the night's thick canopy. The dirt, cold and unyielding, pressed down with a finality that spoke louder than any shout. The texture of the earth, granular, damp, unrelenting, became a shroud, swallowing the last echoes of violence in a silence that thrummed with raw, forced justice. What threads of hope and horror bound the living to the buried, to the acts that defined the turn of a cruel era? In the quiet aftermath, the plantation held its breath beneath a quilt of shadows and dust. The coarse roughness of Samuel's hands lingered in the air, a tactile imprint of resistance and ruin. The ropes, once tools of subjugation, were now inverted instruments of fate, their twisted forms etched into memory like scars upon the land. A chilling stillness enveloped the quarters. Even the restless cotton seemed to pause, sensing the gravity of what had been sealed beneath its roots. Could vengeance carved in earth yield a fragile peace, or would it deepen the lines drawn by centuries of bondage? Would you bear the weight of silence, knowing it held the voices of those buried alive, intertwined with the hope of freedom's first breath? The dense soil whispered an answer only the night could understand, and the stars, though distant and cold, seemed to flicker with uneasy light. As the earth settled, so too did the question linger. What price must be paid when chains become graves, and freedom is won by the silence of the buried? The tactile echo of rough ropes and soil-bound flesh carried forward into a dawn steeped in both dread and defiant resolve. The burial was not merely an end, but an embryonic reckoning, an unspoken demand inscribed in the very fibers of earth and fabric, a stark emblem of a world cracked open, one shovelful of dirt at a time. Dawn scraped weakly over the horizon, its pale light stretching thin as if hesitant to illuminate what the night concealed. The plantation lay shrouded in a heavy stillness, heat pressing against skin and breath, blending the scent of scorched earth with the faint musk of crushed cotton. Silence here was a thick, uneasy thing, bone deep and suffocating. Samuel's hands bore the grit of soil and sweat, fingers trembling ever so slightly, a quiet testament to a night that forever shattered the fragile balance of power. What cost had been paid in the absence of sound? Rumors sparked like dry tinder among the fields, whispered in quick breaths beneath the heavy sun. Men and women in tattered clothes, edged closer with wary eyes, tales twisting like winding vines between truth and fear. The overseers were gone, swallowed whole by earth and shadow, and the weight of their absence fell like a loaded silence upon the land. Samuel felt the ghosts of justice, mercy, and survival war raging within his chest, a storm of conflict sharpened by every lingering glance. Does freedom taste sweeter when it carries the bitterness of those buried beneath? Voices from the fields began to rise, each a fractured note in a discordant hymn. The preacher's voice cracked with longing for grace and peace. The doctor murmured soft remedies against the threat of fever and despair. Gossip twisted fact and fiction into tangled webs. Overseers whispered of fear and lost command. Oral history clashed with cold ledger entries, memory sparring with the erasure penned by unseen hands. What threads remained unbroken in the tapestry of this fractured world? Would you trust the stories told in silence, or those carved into brittle, fading pages? The oppressive heat turned heavy, stifling breaths and pressing dust against skin as the plantation braced for the coming storm of law and reprisal. Alabama's authorities, swift and ruthless, moved to reassert control, their boots matched by the cold clink of chains and the clang of iron. Swift punishments echoed the harsh lessons of an old order, unwilling to yield. Yet beneath the brutal mechanics of power, the fragile blaze of rebellion smoldered on, hidden amidst whispers and wary glances, a silent challenge to the harsh laws forged in desperation. What price would justice demand in the shadow of vengeance? Samuel stood at the crossroad of history and survival, his body etched with scars deeper than skin, his mind a swirl of turbulent resolve and haunting doubt. The plantation, once a bastion of unyielding control, had become a fractured stage, one where broken alliances and desolate hopes played beneath the scorching sun. Blood and dirt mingled in the reckoning, as freedom's first breath came wrapped in shadow. Could the seeds of peace sprout where violence had taken root, or would the harvest be bitter beyond reckoning? The dawn chorus that usually burst forth with birdsong was replaced by a low murmur of restless voices, from the preacher whose words folded in both hope and warning, to the doctor who moved quietly among the weary and wounded, his hands stained with the toil of healing invisible scars. Gossip wound its twisting path through the quarters, weaving stories that shimmered and sank like fleeting ripples on dark water. And from the overseers, a brittle fear colored their whispered complaints, their once certain commands faltering under the weight of vanished authority. Each voice carried a fractured truth, caught somewhere between fierce memory and reluctant erasure. The preacher, a pillar of spiritual sustenance, spoke in measured tones about grace and endurance, seeking light within shadow. His voice was a thread weaving the community's fractured spirit, offering a fragile tether to hope amid ruin. The doctor, somber and steadfast, treated wounds both seen and unseen, the metallic scent of salves blending with the earthy musk of healing poultices. Through murmurs and medical ministrations alike, suffering was met with quiet dignity, a testament to survival forged under ceaseless oppression. What stories did their hands write on bodies and souls alike? Gossip's serpentine whispers twisted facts into tangled knots. Names floated on the wind like fragile leaves, some carried on hope's wings, others trampled beneath suspicion's heavy boot. In these stories, the lines between friend and foe blurred, allegiance shifting like sand underfoot. Fear, fascination, and the desire for understanding collided in every whispered exchange. How much of truth survived the distortions of rumor? Which histories merit the weight of memory? and which dissolve into the dust of forgotten tales. The overseers, those once wielding iron fists and cold commands, now spoke in fractured tones, their fear palpable. Their words trembled between bravado and despair, a brittle veneer cracked by the loss of control. The ledger behind their power lay exposed, filled with gaps and silences, where violence and retribution inscribed their presence. Memory struggled against erasure, a silent duel shaping the very fabric of the plantation's soul. Would you trust the stories forged in secrecy and pain, or the cold, dispassionate records left by those who survived? In this chorus of voices, fractured yet interwoven, the plantation's fractured world struggled to remake itself. The past rode against the present, threads of humanity unspooling through memory and myth alike, fragile strands holding fast against the ravages of erasure. What truths remain buried beneath the dust, waiting for breath to draw them back from silence? In the wake of revolt, the machinery of control ground swiftly into motion. Alabama's lawmen, cloaked in the gravity of broken order, marched with boots echoing steel resolve and cold indifference. Chains rattled beside the clang of iron doors, a harsh rhythm signaling a return to brutal enforcement. The air was thick with dust and fear, stirred by the relentless pursuit of shadows, those who had dared to unravel the harsh tapestry of slavery's law. Silence and cries tangled beneath the relentless clatter of justice, meted not with mercy, but with unyielding severity. Punishments multiplied like dark echoes. The sharp crack of whips, though no longer their first instrument, still lingered in memory and threat. Prisons swelled with bodies bound by suspicion, and the courts, cold and unfeeling, served a mandate that blurred the lines between legality and vengeance. Laws forged in desperation, dusted off and wielded like weapons. The black codes tightened around freed bodies like iron bands, seeking to contain a storm they scarcely understood. What price did the quest for order exact when justice became a sharp-edged blade? Amidst the harsh clang of shackles and tribunal verdicts, whispers of deeper fury festered. The demand for control brought with it a fear that ignited darker fires, mob violence, secret watchmen, and ruthless patrols. These enforcers struck not just at bodies, but at spirits, stamping pathways with terror written in blood and silence. The clash of law and rebellion played out in covert spaces where every shadow carried the threat of betrayal, and every dawn tested the fragile hope of survival. How far would those in power go to reclaim dominion over a fractured world? In this cold rebalancing, Samuel's morose strength stood against the rising tide. Wounds unseen throbbed beneath his measured calm, the weight of his choice a heavy mantle upon battle-scarred shoulders. The plantation, once a place of unchallenged rule, now carried fissures wide and deep, cracks formed by buried vengeance and whispered resistance. Could a man bear the ghosts of what was done and still walk into a dawn scarred by both hope and ruin? Would justice demand more than blood spilled beneath the moonlight? The plantation, once a sprawling stage of silent suffering and command, now fell into disarray beneath a blistering sun that seemed unsympathetic to grief. Families fragmented, torn by suspicion and whispered betrayals, the fragile alliances that had sustained endurance snapping like brittle twigs. Samuel's body, bearing the marks of unyielding toil and sudden violence, moved with a measured, haunted focus. The very earth beneath cotton plants bore the weight of unsettled accounts of blood, revenge, and the unrelenting hunger for liberation. How does a man carry the burden of justice when the ground beneath is soaked with sacrifice? Shadows lengthened with the day, turning fields into arenas where fractured hopes clashed. Conversations hushed abruptly at the approach of strangers, eyes flickered toward hidden corners where stories twisted between memory and lore. The tension in the air was palpable, a thick haze settling on tampered soil. Samuel's gaze shifted often, sharp, distant, and shadowed by choices made under overwhelming pressure. The past clung to him like the coarse fabric of his worn shirt, heavy with the sweat of relentless struggle. Would his actions echo in the hearts of those left behind, or be swallowed by the mute cotton rose? Symbols carried immense weight. The rope, now stained and stretched, was no longer a mere instrument of captivity, but a testament to inverted power and silent justice. In the soil where the overseers were hidden, the earth seemed to pulse with unspoken secrets and reluctant vengeance. The scent of turned dirt mingled with the faded musk of crushed leaves and the faint, bitter tang of blood recollected by memory. Each breath carried traces of conflict, both internal and external, woven into the dense fabric of survival. Could the land itself remember, even as history sought to forget? In the midst of chaos, Samuel felt the heavy cloak of consequence settle firmly on his shoulders. What had begun as a spark of revolt had transformed into a wildfire, consuming the old order and reshaping the contours of power. The plantation, once a prison, had become a crucible, forging both ruin and resilience. Could the line between justice and vengeance hold its shape beneath the harsh light of a new day, or would it dissolve into a storm of relentless reckoning? The plantation and the wider world around it faced an uncertain awakening, the fragile light casting long, wavering shadows that stretched beyond the fields and into the hearts of a fractured society. The promise of abolition had arrived alongside the echo of gunfire and silence, breaking the chains, but releasing a torrent of unfinished reckonings. Federal troops oversaw a chaotic transition, the newly freed striving to reclaim kinship torn by years of cruel separation and to forge independent lives amidst ruins still smoking with conflict. How does a nation rebuild when its foundation was laid on the oppression of millions? In Alabama, Reconstruction unfolded like a bitter script, its pages inked in both hope and repression. The freed people sought refuge, not only from bondage, but from a society eager to reinstate control through black codes, laws designed to shackle liberty with legal chains. Federally established institutions like the Freedmen's Bureau emerged, attempting to negotiate labor contracts that often tethered freed souls to the land and white landowners. Education blossomed cautiously, with schools founded by former slaves becoming beacons of endurance and silent rebellion against erasure. Would these struggles sow the seeds of true freedom, or merely rewrite old bindings in new ink? Political upheaval surged through the state as the radicals took hold, rewriting constitutions and expanding civil rights to once oppressed voices. Yet underneath the surface roiled a fierce backlash, white supremacist factions wielding terror, Ku Klux Klan and others, employed violence to reimpose an order steeped in fear and exclusion. Electioneering amid intimidation, the conflict for power played out in narrow victories and crushing defeats. The era was marked by an unsteady balance, a fragile dance between newly gained rights and relentless efforts to strip them away. How long could hope and hatred coexist within such a volatile landscape? Through it all, the legacy of buried revenge, the echo of Samuel's defiant act, rippled unseen but deeply. The plantation scars were not just physical, but etched into the very culture of resistance and survival. The fight for autonomy, for dignity, and for memory stretched far beyond the fields into courts, schools, and hearts. Would the struggle of those nights buried in silence echo forward into generations, or fade beneath the weight of redemption claimed by those who sought to forget? The slow, unyielding passage of time held its answer tight in the shadows. Samuel's fate, like Alabama itself, was intertwined with this unfolding saga, a testament to the costs and contradictions of freedom, won at such raw expense. The land bore witness to buried bodies, to whispered histories, and to the enduring hope that beyond chains and soil might bloom a dawn not shadowed by past sins. The plantation and the surrounding land faced a fragile awakening as the promise of abolition arrived amid shattered violence and uncertain peace. Federal troops stood watchful, overseeing a transition tangled with the loss and hope of those newly freed from chains. Families once sundered by cruelty sought to gather themselves again, threading kinship through fragmented lives. The air was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, soot, and cotton, but beneath the surface simmered unresolved reckonings waiting to burst forth. How can freedom truly be claimed when its soil is stained with countless sacrifices? In Alabama, the Reconstruction era unfolded as a bitter drama, marked by hope clashing with repression. the newly freed fought not only to escape captivity, but also to evade oppressive black codes, laws that masked old restraints in new legal forms, binding freed souls to the land and white supremacy's grasp. The Freedmen's Bureau became a beacon amid the shadows, trying to guide labor contracts and establish schools where light might pierce the darkness of ignorance and erasure. Could these fragile institutions nurture true freedom or sow new shackles from the ashes of the old? Political upheaval roared beneath this surface. Radical Republicans pushed to rewrite Alabama's constitution, carving out rights and suffrage where none existed before for the formerly enslaved. Yet, in every shadow lurked fierce resistance, white supremacist groups wielding terror with grotesque efficiency. The Ku Klux Klan and its allies stalked the night, enforcing a brutal order dripping with violence and fear, electioneering marred by intimidation and murder. This deadly dance of power and oppression unfolded in narrow victories and crushing defeats. How long could hope endure in a land riven by hatred? Through this charged landscape, the legacy of buried rebellion, like Samuel's silent revenge, rippled beneath the surface. These scars were poems of resistance etched deep into the soil and spirit. The struggle for dignity extended beyond fields into courts, schoolhouses, and homes, reaching far beyond what was seen or recorded. Would the story of those nights sealed in dirt and silence echo forward into generations, or be swallowed by the relentless tide of forgetting? Time held its reluctant answer, locked tightly in shadows and light. Samuel's fate intertwined irrevocably with this unfolding saga, a testament to freedom's cost and contradiction. The earth bore witness to buried bodies and whispered histories, to the silent rebellion beneath cotton and dirt. Beyond chains and soil, a dawn stirred, its light uneven, scarred, but resolute. Decades slid by like shadows lengthening at dusk, blurring the lines between fact and legend in the quiet corners of Alabama's fading slave quarters. Descendants gathered around flickering fires, their voices hesitant, piecing together fractured tales, passed down in whispered lore, stories of betrayal, rebellion, and the haunting night when the earth swallowed overseers alive. Yet the archives told a colder story, records with missing pages, deliberate omissions, and silences where defiant acts trembled beneath bureaucratic erasure. What remains when history's keepers do not wish to keep? Ghosts of rope and earth wove through these memories, symbols both tangible and spectral, binding generations to a past, refused by many but embraced by some. The coarseness of fibers against skin in remembered tales, the smell of disturbed soil beneath cotton, and the crackle of embers in storytelling fires gave texture to a history lived and relived. Yet, alongside these vibrant oral histories stood the coldness of official records, ledger books where key names were crossed out, trial testimonies lost or altered, a silence louder than any voice. Would the truth, like rope frayed by time, eventually snap free from the bonds of omission? Would you dare to trust memory when it is tangled with myth, when every story risks distortion or sanctification? Across the landscapes, scarred by chains and secrets, descendants balanced fragile threads of identity between what was spoken and what was hidden. In such spaces, memory became a battlefield where truth fought for survival against the erasure wrought by time and will. What truth might be resurrected from this interchange, and could it be honored before fading into oblivion? The struggle between remembrance and oblivion extended beyond family fires, etched into the soil, whispered in the creak of weathered beams, and pulsing through the ongoing fight for recognition. The rope and soil were more than motifs. They were living echoes of resistance and survival, reminders that history, though often suppressed, breathes in those who dare to remember. The question lingered: who claims the past when memory is contested and history is stitched in shadows? In this tension between presence and absence, the story of that burial night persisted, neither fully recorded nor wholly forgotten, its threads woven deep into the fabric of collective consciousness and contested narratives.